Experts say that the fuel crisis in Russia could escalate into a collapse. 3 more regions in Siberia and the Far East have introduced restrictions on gasoline sales. At gas stations in the Irkutsk region, Buryatia, and Zabaikalsky Krai, no more than 20 liters of fuel are sold per person. How the war is turning into a collapse of the Russian energy market is the subject of our next report.
The Novokuybishevsk oil refinery shut down 2 main oil processing units after a drone attack on October 19th. This is already the second shutdown of the plant in a month, and it is one of the largest in the region. The enterprise produces more than 20 types of products, has an annual processing capacity of about 5 million tons, and supplies the needs of the Russian army. Rosneft has not commented on the situation so far. A shortage of gasoline and diesel has already been recorded in 84% of Russian regions. And the new disruptions have affected the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug, Tuva, Udmurtia, and the Kurgan region. Even in oil refining Tyumen, a limit of 30 liters per person has been imposed on sales. And gasoline prices have rapidly risen to 70 to 80 rubles per liter. At first, the crisis caused gas stations in many regions to run dry and prices for gasoline and diesel to rise. Drones continue to strike energy and fuel infrastructure, which only worsens the shortage even further.
Who brought up the topic about Novosibirsk? Well, here we go.
No 92 and no 95 either.
Ukrainian drone strikes on oil refineries will restrain oil processing in the Russian Federation at least until mid-2026. Due to the attacks, Moscow is losing revenue and is forced to limit fuel exports, reports the International Energy Agency.
Earlier, we expected processing to normalize by the end of the year, but now we are taking a more cautious outlook. Oil processing in Russia will remain below 5 million barrels per day until June 2026. The increasingly large-scale Ukrainian drone campaign against Russian refineries and infrastructure has already reduced processing by about 500,000 barrels per day, according to a report from the International Energy Agency.
The Institute for the Study of War notes that the Ukrainian campaign of strikes on Russia's energy infrastructure is having an increasingly serious impact on the domestic fuel market. This is causing shortages, price spikes, and creating risks of inflation and macroeconomic instability. The growing fuel crisis is also becoming one of the levers of pressure on Russia to end the war. Energy, as one of the key areas of pressure on Moscow, is at the center of the EU's 19th sanctions package. In particular, they provide for a complete ban on the import of Russian gas into EU countries by January 1st.
The year 2027.
This week, we intend to adopt a new major package of sanctions against Russia. Every euro we deprive Russia of is a euro it cannot use for military purposes. The ministers also made it clear that after the 19th package, we should work on the next one. It will not be the last. We must not forget that Russia is the aggressor and Ukraine is the victim. Therefore, putting pressure on Ukraine as the victim is the wrong approach. And not only for Ukraine, but also for European and global security. Because if aggression pays off, it serves as an invitation to use it elsewhere as well.
Hungary will not obstruct the adoption of the 19th package of European Union sanctions against Russia. This was stated by the country's foreign minister, Péter Szijjártó, since, according to him, all points allegedly contradicting Hungary's national interests were removed from the sanctions package. Slovakia has also put forward its own demands for approving the 19th package of restrictions against Russia, as it still depends on Russian gas. In turn, the Czech Republic stated that it is ready to provide Slovakia with expedited gas support after the European Union's energy ministers decided to gradually phase out imports of Russian gas.
We believe that this is technically possible. We will present our calculations to the European Commission to demonstrate the potential for supplies through Western routes. If Slovakia needs closer cooperation, the Czech Republic is ready. The Slovak side thanked us. Such an option exists, but the initiative must come from Slovakia. If they reach out, we are ready to act immediately. Lukáš Vojtěch, Minister of Trade and Industry of the Czech Republic, and a report from Euractiv.
India is gradually shifting from Russian to Asian oil, reports Bloomberg. The Indian company Reliance Industries is increasing its purchases of Middle Eastern crude and is ready to place more orders in the near future. And U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated the importance of increasing economic pressure from the G7 countries on Russia in order to speed up the end of the war.
Of course, we need to understand that there is a combined effect here. There are both strikes and sanctions, because sanctions also have an impact, and they complement each other. So it's really impossible to measure exactly which has had a greater effect. To determine who caused more damage, you would really need to have a huge amount of information, which only Russia possesses, and it's not so easy to access it. Nevertheless, it is clear that these strikes are definitely contributing to Russia losing its former significance in the global energy market, especially in petroleum products. In other words, Russia is essentially removing itself from this market since a ban has been in effect since the beginning of this year. On the export of these very petroleum products from Russia, let me remind you, before the war, this brought Russia about $100 billion a year. For example, in 2024, Russia earned $47 billion from this. Nevertheless, we see that Russia is saying no. We no longer want to export petroleum products, most likely because we have a shortage of these very products. And here, yes, undoubtedly, the strikes play a major role, but also sanctions which have essentially forced Russia to turn to the east, primarily to China, which buys from Russia at a discount that is significantly below the nominal price, and sometimes, as many analysts note, possibly even below cost price. And as a result, all this leads to the situation where the so-called pivot to the east, which Russia talks about, in practice comes down to the following. Russia sells oil to China at a discount. China refines this oil into petroleum products and then sells these petroleum products back to Russia without any discount. In other words, Russia is essentially losing money, and because of the policy it pursues, it basically has no alternatives. That is, it is forced to play by the rules dictated by China, and naturally, China will not give Russia any advantage. China is looking out for its own interests. Therefore, in this case, sanctions do play their role. I want to emphasize that here, the combination of our strikes and external sanctions, while not acting quickly, are leading to the result we are all waiting for.
Another important point. Let's continue a bit with the topic of the Trump-Putin meeting and the so-called cards. After all, it was Putin who became more active, and according to Trump's statement, it was specifically the Russian side that was interested in the call and this meeting. In Budapest, the upcoming one. And here's an interesting point. According to information from the Washington Post, which, by the way, is being checked by Trump, the territorial issue is being discussed in this context as far as I understand. And here, in this territorial context, the topic of strikes on Russian oil refineries with Ukrainian long-range weapons intersects with it. And to what extent can this topic actually run in parallel in the case of ending the war?
Well, undoubtedly, if we use Trump's terminology, this is also a card in our hand. Because in principle, according to the same information from the media and various leaks, the effectiveness of Ukrainian strikes on Russian targets has increased largely due to the fact that Ukraine, let's say, is coordinating these strikes with its partners in the United States. And if under the previous administration, with its full support for Ukraine, when no one criticized Ukraine and it was declared that no one would negotiate with Russia, and Ukraine had a reliable ally in the previous administration, at the same time, the previous administration only said, please just don't strike Russian oil refineries. And accordingly, they would not provide any information that could help do so. The current administration does not take such a position, quite the opposite, in fact. At the same time, as is known from those same media leaks, it is specifically the American side, namely the intelligence services of the United States, who, first of all, do not tell Ukraine not to strike there. So in this case, Ukraine does not have that restriction. And secondly, since, again, they do not prohibit strikes on Russian oil refineries, these very intelligence agencies provide Ukraine with information about the locations of Russian air defense forces, which zones to avoid, and how to bypass them. In other words, Ukraine is receiving very important information here that helps increase the effectiveness of strikes on Russian oil refineries. And by and large, this was logical, both under the previous administration and the current one. Firstly, it does not affect global oil prices, which was a concern for the previous administration. But at the same time, it knocks a competitor of the United States out of the global energy market. Accordingly, these strikes, which it seems to me are not just being coordinated, but are possibly even supported by the current US administration. They are hitting Russia very hard, And the leverage Trump holds in these negotiations is not just about territories. It's about the fact that if Russia doesn't stop, the US will continue providing Ukraine with all the necessary intelligence until Russia simply runs out of capacity to process oil, which will severely undermine its entirely oil-dependent economy. So we'll have to wait and see here, but for now, we're all still in a waiting phase for the Budapest meeting, just like everyone once waited for the meeting in Anchorage. However, let's remember how the meeting in Alaska ended. It ended with Trump being too angry, and that's when the information I mentioned earlier came up. Ukraine began receiving intelligence from the American side regarding more effective routes for attacking Russian oil refineries. This started to appear right after the unsuccessful meeting in Anchorage. So now we'll see, but we still have to wait and find out whether this meeting will happen or not, and then see how it goes. And as a direct result of an unsuccessful meeting between Putin and Trump, if it turns out to be unsuccessful, Ukraine still did not receive even a single Tomahawk for a demonstrative strike on Russian territory.